County are still struggling to understand what happened and why there are still no answers.
Every day, almost, I go by the RCMP, and it's just so tragic. Just so tragic.
Tonight is about saying a prayer, and we're going to light the way home for them.
Two children walked into their kitchen on a quiet Friday morning. By 10 o'clock a.m., they had disappeared without a trace. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses, and according to the police, no crime. After analyzing over 5,000 pieces of evidence, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, and conducting one of the most extensive searches in Canadian history, the RCMP concluded that the disappearance of 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan was, quote, not believed to be criminal in nature, not criminal. Two babies gone forever, and somehow not a crime. The evidence that has been uncovered doesn't just contradict that statement, it obliterates it. We're talking about torn pink blankets that move by themselves, boot prints that appear overnight, and a family whose stories change more often than the weather. Newly unsealed warrant documents reveal a shocking truth about what really happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about this case. The lies, the cover-ups, the evidence that points to something so unsettling that even the children's own grandmother refuses to believe they wandered into those woods. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. I'm talking about a case where a stepfather delays taking a polygraph test, where a mother blocks family members on social media the same day her children disappear, and where physical evidence appears in impossible locations. This isn't just another missing children case. This is a master class in how the system fails the most vulnerable among us. By the end of this, you'll understand why thousands of people across the globe are demanding answers that Canadian authorities refuse to provide. You'll see why even family members don't believe the official story, and you'll discover why this case represents something far more terrifying than a simple disappearance. The final confirmed sighting of 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan was captured on security cameras at a Dollarama store in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. They were with their mother, Malaya Brooks, and stepfather, Daniel Martel. Just another family shopping trip. Just another ordinary afternoon. Except it wasn't ordinary at all. The children had been kept home from school that day. The official reason was cost. But when you dig deeper into this family's history, when you see the pattern of events leading up to this moment, that innocent explanation takes on a much darker meaning. Teachers had been bringing clothes to school for these children. Think about that for a moment. Teachers, professionals trained to spot signs of neglect, were so concerned about Jack and Lily's appearance that they were providing clothing. CPS had been involved. There were reports of bruising, and now suddenly the children are too sick for school on what would be their final day of freedom. Malaya and Daniel walk through that store with two children in tow, captured on camera for the last time. But here's what makes this footage so haunting. It's not what you see. It's what happens next. Because less than 20 hours later, those same children would vanish from the face of the earth. The family lived in a trailer at 1407 Gearlock Road in Pictou County, a remote, isolated place where screams go unheard and secrets stay buried. Their home sat on a property where Daniel's mother, Janie Mackenzie, known locally as Junkyard Janie, lived in a camper in the backyard. 3 adults, 2 children, 1 baby named Meadow, and according to everyone involved, a house full of problems. Daniel worked 1 day a week at a sawmill in Westville. 1 day, that's barely enough to keep food on the table, let alone support a family of 6. Financial desperation was crushing this household. They owed money everywhere, bank accounts were empty. And when people get desperate, when the walls are closing in, when children become burdens instead of blessings, that's when the unthinkable becomes possible. But May 1st seemed normal enough, the Dollarama trip. The children staying home sick, evening routines, bedtime stories perhaps. A mother tucking her babies in one last time. A stepfather who by all accounts had a voice those children listened to. a grandmother in the backyard who would later claim she heard them playing the next morning. As darkness fell over Gearlock Road that Thursday night, as Daniel allegedly wedged a wrench into the front door to keep bears out, as Malaya settled Baby Meadow for the night, those two innocent children went to sleep for the final time in their own beds. What happened in the hours between May 1st at 2:45 p.m. and May 2nd at 10 o'clock a.m. would become one of Canada's most baffling missing children cases. But as you're about to discover, there's nothing baffling about it at all. The evidence is there, the timeline is clear, the contradictions are glaring. By morning, Jack and Lilly Sullivan would be gone. And despite what authorities claim, despite the polygraph results, despite the extensive searches, one fact remains undeniable. Children don't just vanish into thin air. Someone knows what happened to them. Someone always knows. Let's step inside the morning that changed everything. The morning when two children supposedly walked out their back door and disappeared forever. Somewhere between 6 o'clock a.m. and 10 o'clock a.m., inside a rundown trailer on Gearlock Road, a story was being written that would never make sense. According to Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks, they were in bed with Baby Meadow when they heard Jack and Lilly playing in the kitchen. Normal morning sounds, children being children. Lilly, they said, poked her head into the bedroom multiple times. Actually, their story changed on this detail too. First it was, came in the room many times, then it became, poked their head in many times. Already the cracks were showing. Picture this scene, a cramped trailer, two adults in bed with an infant and somehow two young children, a 6-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy, decide to leave everything they know behind and walk into the Canadian wilderness alone, without telling anyone, without taking food, water, or anything except their boots and Lily's backpack. Does that sound believable to you? What 6-year-old takes responsibility for a 4-year-old and decides to venture into dangerous woods without adult supervision? But here's where the story gets truly bizarre. Daniel claims he wedged a wrench into the front door the night before to keep a black bear from pushing it open, a black bear that he supposedly saw while they were outside in the late evening. Now, I want you to think about this logically. If there's a dangerous bear in your area so close to your home that you need to barricade your door, wouldn't you be extra vigilant about where your children are? Wouldn't you make sure they couldn't wander outside unsupervised? Wouldn't the first thing you do when you realize they're missing be to panic about that same bear? But that's not what happened. Instead, according to their timeline, Daniel and Malaya lay in bed for an undetermined amount of time before Daniel finally went to check on the children. How long were they in bed while two small children were supposedly wandering around unsupervised? 30 minutes? An hour? 2 hours? They've never said, and that silence speaks volumes. When Daniel finally got up to check, he found the trailer empty. The children's boots were gone. Lily's backpack was missing, but that wrench, that convenient bear deterrent wrench, was still perfectly in place, meaning the only way out was through the back sliding door. Think about what that means. Two children, ages 4 and 6, supposedly opened a sliding door, stepped outside into territory where a dangerous bear had been spotted, and walked away from the only home they'd ever known without saying goodbye, without leaving a note, without any indication of where they were going or why. And here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. Daniel's mother, Janie Mackenzie, was sleeping in a camper just yards away in the backyard. She claims she heard the children playing outside that morning, then conveniently fell back asleep and woke to Daniel calling their names. But Janie, a woman who knew these children intimately, has stated clearly that she doesn't believe they wandered into the woods. She told RCMP that Jack wouldn't go for a walk on his own, that during family walks, they often had to carry Jack because he got tired and would just sit down. This is a 4-year-old boy who gets tired during supervised family walks, but somehow managed to trek into dangerous wilderness with his 6-year-old sister. The timeline alone should have raised every red flag possible. Malaya didn't call 911 until 10 o'clock a.m. Let me repeat that. Her children were missing, potentially in bear territory, and she waited until 10 o'clock a.m. to call for help. What parent discovers their babies are gone and doesn't immediately call the police? But it gets worse, much worse. Instead of calling authorities first, Daniel took the family car to search for them. He went looking in woods and culverts. He called friends to join the search, all before police were even notified. What was he looking for? What was he hoping to find or hoping to hide before authorities arrived? And here's the detail that should haunt every parent watching this. While Daniel was supposedly searching frantically for the children, while Malaya was dealing with police, while an entire community mobilized to find 2 missing babies, someone was making other plans, because by that same evening, the first piece of evidence would appear that would turn this case from a missing children investigation into something far more sinister. Evidence that would prove these children never walked into those woods on their own. Evidence that would reveal the truth about what really happened during those unaccounted for hours between Thursday night and Friday morning. While Daniel claimed to be searching woods and culverts, while Malaya was giving her statement to police, something extraordinary was happening on Gearlock Road, something that would either provide hope for finding the children alive or reveal just how elaborate this deception really was. A witness came forward. A woman driving down Gearlock Road between 9:30 and 10 a.m. on May 2nd reported seeing 2 children walking along the roadside, a girl holding a young boy's hand heading toward Westville. For a moment it seemed like a breakthrough. Finally, confirmation that Jack and Lilly had indeed left on their own. Finally, proof that Daniel and Malaya were telling the truth. But then investigators looked closer at the witness description and everything fell apart. The witness described a girl she estimated to be 9 or 10 years old with darkish hair and pigtails, wearing a tank top with blue strings. The boy appeared to be about 5. But here's the problem. Lilly Sullivan was only 6 years old and Jack was 4. The witness was describing children who were significantly older than the missing Sullivan kids. Think about that discrepancy. When children go missing, witnesses typically estimate ages younger than reality due to emotional distress and the desire to help. But this witness estimated older, much older, almost as if she saw completely different children altogether. And there's another detail that makes this sighting even more suspicious. The witness reported seeing a white woman, estimated 50 to 60 years old, with a loose curly haircut, standing beside an older model light gold or tan sedan. The car was parked on the shoulder with the rear passenger door open. A car with an open door. An adult woman nearby. Children who didn't match the description of Jack and Lilly. Does this sound like 2 kids wandering off on their own, or does it sound like something else entirely? RCMP investigators stated they were working to identify these children to determine if they were actually Jack and Lilly, but here's what they didn't tell the public. They already knew these weren't the Sullivan children. The age discrepancy alone made that clear, so why publicize this sighting at all? Why give false hope to a community desperate for answers? Unless they needed people to believe the children had left on their own, unless they needed to support the narrative that Jack and Lilly walked away from home voluntarily. Meanwhile, back at 1407 Gearlock Road, the real evidence was telling a completely different story. While hundreds of volunteers searched the wilderness, while helicopters circled overhead, while search and rescue teams combed through every possible hiding spot, the physical evidence was painting a picture of something far more unsettling than 2 children wandering off. The boot prints, the blanket pieces, the changing stories, the convenient timing, all of it pointed to one terrifying conclusion. These children never left that property alive. But Daniel and Malaya had one more card to play. One more way to convince investigators they were innocent. They volunteered for polygraph tests, and according to official reports they passed. But what those polygraph results don't tell you is the story behind them, the delays, the behavior, the questions that were asked, and the questions that weren't. Because when you dig into the details of those polygraph sessions, you discover something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about lie detector tests. Something that proves passing a polygraph doesn't always mean telling the truth. Friday evening, May 2nd, while the community was mobilizing the largest search effort in Pictou County history, family members made a discovery that would change everything. About a kilometer from the Sullivan home in Brush-off Lansdowne Station Road, they found a torn piece of pink fabric, a piece of Lily's blanket. But here's where this discovery becomes impossible to explain logically. According to Malaya Brooks, this pink blanket had most recently been used around the edge of a drafty window in the trailer. She described it as covering a window in what appears to have been Jack and Lily's bedroom. Daniel's story was different. First, he said it was for a window, then he changed it to a door, then back to a window. But here's the detail that should make every parent watching this feel sick to their stomach. On Friday morning, when the children allegedly left their home, that pink blanket was in their bedroom. Daniel and Malaya both confirmed this. It was hanging up, covering a drafty window where their children slept. By Friday evening, a piece of that same blanket was found torn and scattered in brush, a full kilometer away from their home. How does a blanket travel from a child's bedroom to the woods without human intervention? How does fabric tear itself and position itself perfectly along a search route where it would inevitably be found? But it gets worse, so much worse. On Saturday, May 4th, 2 days after the children disappeared, another piece of that pink blanket was discovered. This time it was found in a garbage bag at the end of the family's driveway. Let me paint this picture for you. A blanket that was hanging in the children's bedroom on Friday morning is found torn in the woods on Friday evening. And then another piece of that same blanket appears in the family's own garbage 2 days later. This isn't children wandering off. This is evidence placement. This is someone creating a trail. This is someone trying to support a narrative that makes no logical sense, and Daniel knew it. When family members first found that piece of blanket in the woods when they asked him if it belonged to Lily, his first response was no. He denied it completely. Only later, after being pressed, did he change his story and admit it was from Lily's blanket. Why lie about something so easily verifiable? Why deny ownership of evidence that could help find the missing children? Unless, of course, you know exactly how that evidence got there, unless you put it there yourself. RCMP brought in a dog unit to search the area where the blanket was found. These are not pets. These are highly trained tracking dogs whose abilities have solved countless missing person cases. The dogs found nothing. No scent trail. No indication that Jack and Lily had ever been in that area. For children to leave no scent trail, especially after spending time in one location long enough to tear a blanket and scatter it in brush, is virtually impossible. Children leave a scent everywhere they go. Their shoes, their clothing, their natural body oils, all of it creates a trail that trained dogs can follow hours or even days later. But there was no trail because Jack and Lily were never in those woods. Someone placed that blanket there to create the illusion that they had been, and that someone had access to their bedroom, someone who could take a blanket from the children's sleeping area, tear it up, and plant it in locations that would support the story of children wandering off on their own. Someone who lived in that house. The evidence is about to get even more compelling. We're talking about boot prints that appear overnight, financial desperation that creates motive, and a polygraph session that reveals more about deception than truth. First, let's talk about the search that found everything except the children. When RCMP launched their investigation, they didn't hold back. This became one of the most extensive missing children searches in maritime history. We're talking about hundreds of ground search and rescue volunteers, helicopters circling overhead, police sniffer dogs covering every square inch of terrain, and a systematic search of forests and lakes surrounding the rural home. The scope was staggering. They pumped area septic systems looking for any trace of the children. They collected video footage from private cameras within an 8-kilometer radius. They gathered recordings from businesses and school buses traveling in the area that morning. At the Cobequid Pass toll booth alone, they analyzed over 5,000 videos and photos, 5,000 pieces of visual evidence from a single location. They followed up on 670 tips from the public, each one investigated, each one documented, each one leading nowhere. They interviewed everyone who had contact with or knew the children or their family, co-workers, neighbors, teachers, relatives, friends, hundreds of people providing statements, sharing observations, offering theories. This was not a half-hearted effort. This was a full-scale mobilization of resources, manpower, and technology. If Jack and Lilly Sullivan had wandered into those woods, if they had left any trace of their passage, if they had gone anywhere near the search areas, this investigation would have found them. But here's what makes this search so telling. They found evidence of the children everywhere except where children would logically be found. Boot prints appeared in a pipeline area through the woods behind the family home. Not just random prints, but what search coordinator Amy Hansen described as clumps of them in 2 different sizes that were small and corresponded to what the children would wear. Clumps of boot prints. Think about that phrase, not a trail showing movement through the woods, not prints indicating children walking in a specific direction. Clumps. As if someone had deliberately created multiple impressions in a concentrated area to simulate the presence of children. And the timing of this discovery is crucial. These prints were found sometime between Friday evening, when the children disappeared, and Saturday morning. They appeared overnight in an area that had been preliminarily searched on Friday without any findings. RCMP took a cast of 1 boot print and found it had the number 29 marked on its tread, corresponding to a size 11 child's boot. Using Malaya's banking records, they confirmed she had purchased size 11 children's boots for Lily at Walmart in March. A perfect match. Almost too perfect. But here's what makes this evidence suspect rather than conclusive. If Jack and Lily had actually walked through this area, where was the scent trail? Where were the other traces of their passage? Where was the path showing their direction of travel? Professional search dogs found nothing in this area. No scent, no trail, no indication that living children had ever been there. Search and rescue teams noted something else disturbing. They heard reports of people with kids out searching. Translation. During the official search efforts, civilians with children were also combing the area, creating additional foot traffic, additional boot prints, and additional contamination of potential evidence. Among those civilian searchers was Daniel Martell himself, who had been searching the area since Thursday evening, hours before police were even notified. The search effort was massive, professional, and thorough. Ground teams, air support, water searches, electronic surveillance, forensic analysis, everything possible was deployed to find these children. And that's exactly what makes the official conclusion so impossible to accept. After the most extensive search in the region's history, after analyzing thousands of pieces of evidence, after interviewing hundreds of witnesses, RCMP concluded that Jack and Lily's disappearance was not believed to be criminal in nature. Not criminal. Despite the fact that 2 children vanished without a trace, despite the planted evidence, despite the changing stories, and despite the fact that their own family members don't believe they wandered into the woods, the evidence tells a different story, a story of careful planning, evidence manipulation, and a cover-up that goes to the very heart of this family. The real answers were hiding in the digital footprints left behind. Text messages, bank records, location data, and communication patterns would reveal the truth about what happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan, the truth that someone desperately wanted to hide. What's fascinating about lie detector tests is they don't actually detect lies. They detect stress responses, changes in blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, and skin conductivity. They measure anxiety, nervousness, fear, and sometimes people with the most to hide are the calmest under pressure. Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks both volunteered for polygraph examinations. Both were found to have answered truthfully. Case closed, right? The parents passed their lie detector test, so they must be innocent. Except there's something the public wasn't told about those polygraph sessions. Something that reveals just how manipulated this entire process really was. Daniel delayed taking his polygraph test. When questioned about the timeline, his response was telling, I don't really know the date. It was a couple weeks ago, I want to say. You don't know the date you took a lie detector test about your missing stepchildren. You don't remember the most important appointment of your life. The test that would supposedly clear your name and help focus the search efforts on finding Jack and Lily? That's not forgetfulness, that's calculated delay, that's buying time, time to prepare, time to practice, time to get your story straight. Because here's what most people don't understand about polygraph tests. They're not magical truth detectors. They can be beaten. People with certain personality disorders, people under the influence of certain substances, people who have practiced controlling their responses, they can all manipulate the results. And there's another factor that makes these polygraph results even more suspicious. The questions asked during these examinations are redacted, completely blacked out in the warrant documents. We have no idea what Daniel and Malaya were actually asked. Were they asked directly if they were involved in the children's disappearance? Were they asked if they knew where the children were? Were they asked about the timeline, the evidence placement, the changing stories? Or were they asked carefully crafted questions designed to produce truthful responses while avoiding the real issues? We'll never know, and that's exactly the point. But here's what we do know. Janie Mackenzie, Daniel's own mother, was found to have physiology not suitable for analysis, and an opinion on the polygraph examination was not rendered. Translation: she couldn't take the test officially because of a claimed heart condition. How convenient. The one person who was supposedly in the backyard, who claimed to hear the children playing that morning, who had the best opportunity to observe what really happened, can't take a polygraph test for medical reasons. Even Cody Sullivan, the children's biological father, who had been separated from Malaya since October 2021, took not one but 2 polygraph examinations. He passed both. Why 2 tests for someone who hadn't lived with the family for years, but a medical exemption for the grandmother who was right there when it happened? The polygraph results created a false sense of security. They allowed investigators to check boxes, to say they'd eliminated the obvious suspects, to shift focus away from the family and toward the impossible theory that 2 small children had wandered off on their own. But polygraphs don't solve crimes. Evidence does, and the evidence was about to reveal something that would make those test results completely irrelevant. Because while Daniel and Malaya were convincing lie detectors they were innocent, physical evidence was appearing that would prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Evidence that would show not just that they were being untruthful, but how they were being untruthful. Evidence that would reveal the careful planning behind Jack and Lily's disappearance. Evidence that would expose the truth about what really happened during those crucial hours when 2 children vanished forever. And it all started with footprints that defied logic and timeline manipulation that revealed the true nature of this event. On Saturday morning, May 3rd, search and rescue teams were combing every inch of wilderness around the Sullivan property when they made a discovery that should have broken the case wide open. In a pipeline area through the woods behind 1407 Gearlock Road, they found child-sized boot prints, but not just any boot prints. According to search coordinator Amy Hansen, there were clumps of them in 2 different sizes that were small and corresponded to what the children would wear. On the surface, this seemed like the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Finally, concrete evidence that Jack and Lily had indeed ventured into the woods. Finally, proof that the family story was true. But when you examine the details of this discovery, when you consider the timing and the circumstances, these boot prints become evidence of something far more troubling than children wandering off. First, the timing. These prints were discovered sometime between Friday evening and Saturday morning. They weren't there during the initial search efforts on Friday. They appeared overnight in an area that had already been preliminarily searched without any findings. Think about what that means. Either Jack and Lily were hiding in this area for over 24 hours while hundreds of people searched for them, or someone placed evidence there after the search had moved to other locations. Which scenario seems more likely? 2 small children evading professional search teams for an entire day and night, or someone with intimate knowledge of the search patterns placing evidence where it would inevitably be found. Second, the nature of the prints themselves. Clumps of boot prints does not describe children walking through the woods. It describes someone repeatedly stepping in the same area to create multiple impressions. It describes evidence staging. If Jack and Lily had actually walked through this area, there would be a clear trail showing their direction of movement. There would be prints leading to this location and prints leading away from it. There would be other signs of their passage, disturbed vegetation, possibly dropped items, areas where they had stopped to rest. Instead, investigators found isolated clumps of prints with no clear directional pattern. RCMP took a cast of one boot print and found the number 29 marked on its tread, indicating a size 11 child's boot. They used Malaya's banking records to confirm she had purchased size 11 boots for Lilly at Walmart in March. They even purchased identical boots for comparison purposes. A perfect match. But perfect evidence in imperfect circumstances often reveals the truth about how it got there. And here's the detail that exposes the entire deception. Search and rescue teams reported hearing about people with kids out searching. During the official search efforts, civilians with children were also in the area, creating additional foot traffic, creating additional boot prints. Among those civilian searchers was Daniel Martell himself, who had been in these woods since Thursday evening, hours before police were notified. Daniel had access to Lilly's boots. He had intimate knowledge of the search areas. He had the opportunity to place evidence where it would be found, and he had motive to create a trail suggesting the children had wandered off on their own. But the boot print evidence reveals something even more disturbing. If these prints were genuinely made by Jack and Lilly during their supposed journey into the woods, where are Jack's prints? The search teams found prints in 2 different sizes, supposedly corresponding to both children. But Jack was only 4 years old. His boots would have been significantly smaller than Lily's size 11s. Yet, the casting and analysis focused entirely on the larger prints, the ones that matched Lily's boots. Why? Because creating convincing evidence for a 4-year-old's participation in this supposed journey would have been much more difficult. It's one thing to stomp around in a 6-year-old's boots. It's another thing entirely to simulate the footprint pattern of a tired 4-year-old being led through unfamiliar terrain. The boot print evidence was meant to support the narrative that the children walked into the woods. But like everything else in this case, it raises more questions than it answers. And those questions become even more disturbing when you realize that while this evidence was being discovered, the children's family was already moving on with their lives in ways that would shock any grieving parent. Do you believe children can vanish this completely without help? Because what I'm about to reveal will prove they can't. While search teams were finding convenient boot prints and strategically placed blanket pieces, RCMP investigators were conducting a different kind of search. They were diving deep into the digital lives of Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks, following electronic breadcrumbs that would either confirm their innocence or expose their guilt. What they found was a masterclass in digital deception. First, the cell phone evidence. Daniel and Malaya both claimed they kept location tracking turned on at all times so they could monitor each other's whereabouts. They voluntarily handed over their phones to police, which seemed like the behavior of innocent people with nothing to hide. But there was a problem, a big problem. Daniel had told investigators that Malaya's phone was dead that morning, completely powered off. No battery. Yet in the same breath, he also claimed that Malaya was playing on her phone. A dead phone, but somehow still functional enough for entertainment. The contradiction is glaring. Either the phone was dead or Malaya was using it. It can't be both. But Daniel presented both versions of events as if they could coexist, as if investigators wouldn't notice the impossible timeline he was creating. And here's what makes this even more suspicious. They had virtually no cell service in their area anyway. So why the emphasis on phone activity and location tracking in a dead zone? Why the detailed discussions about device usage in an area where devices barely functioned? Because the phone evidence was meant to establish alibis to show that Daniel and Malaya were where they claimed to be during the crucial hours, to provide electronic proof of their innocence. But the warrant documents reveal something else entirely. RCMP obtained records for text plus messages from May 1st and May 2nd from 3 redacted phone numbers. Text plus. Do you know what that is? It's a VoIP service, Voice over Internet Protocol. These aren't traditional phone numbers. They're digital communication lines that work through data or Wi-Fi connections. They're popular with people who want to communicate without using their regular phone service, people who might want to keep certain conversations off their main devices. Why would a struggling family with no money and poor cell service use multiple VoIP lines? What conversations were they having that couldn't go through their regular phones? What were they discussing on May 1st and May 2nd that required this level of digital secrecy? The banking records told their own story of desperation. Daniel and Malaya were broke, completely financially devastated. Daniel worked 1 day a week at a sawmill, barely enough income to survive, let alone support a family of 6. They owed money everywhere. They couldn't keep funds in bank accounts because creditors would garnish them immediately. According to Daniel's own admissions, they had robbed Grandma. Financial desperation was crushing this household, creating a pressure cooker environment where children might be seen as financial burdens rather than beloved family members. And then there's the location data. Both Daniel and Malaya claimed they kept GPS tracking enabled on their phones constantly. But conveniently, during the crucial hours between Thursday evening and Friday morning, the exact time frame when Jack and Lilly disappeared, there are gaps in their digital footprints. Gaps that suggest phones were turned off. Gaps that indicate someone didn't want their movements tracked during specific time periods. Gaps that align perfectly with when 2 children vanished from their home. RCMP also sought electronic records from companies in Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax, whose names and purposes are completely redacted in the warrant documents. What kind of records? What companies? What digital trail were investigators following that led them to major Canadian cities? The redactions hide crucial information, but the scope suggests this investigation uncovered digital evidence that extended far beyond the local area. Evidence that might reveal planning, coordination, or communication with outside parties. But perhaps most telling of all is what happened with the family's communication patterns on the day the children disappeared. Malaya blocked Daniel on messaging apps. On the same day her children went missing, she cut off digital communication with their stepfather. Not after days of grief and blame, not after weeks of investigation stress. On the same day. Why block someone you're supposedly working with to find missing children? Why cut off communication with the other adult who was present when they disappeared? Unless, of course, you're trying to prevent investigators from seeing your real-time communications. Unless you're making sure there's no digital record of what you were really discussing that day. The electronic evidence reveals a pattern of deception, financial desperation, and digital manipulation that completely contradicts the simple story of children wandering off on their own. These weren't grieving parents trying to find their missing children. These were people trying to control the narrative, manage the evidence, and maintain alibis that would keep them out of prison. And the most compelling evidence was yet to come, because what investigators found in those warrant documents would reveal not just what happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan, but why it happened. Before Jack and Lilly Sullivan disappeared, their lives were already a nightmare. The warrant documents reveal a household where neglect and dysfunction were the norm, not the exception. This wasn't a loving family torn apart by tragedy. This was a powder keg waiting to explode. Teachers were bringing clothes to school for these children. Let that sink in for a moment. Professional educators, people trained to maintain appropriate boundaries with students, were so concerned about Jack and Lily's basic needs that they were personally providing clothing. When teachers start bringing clothes to school, it means children are coming to class dirty, inappropriately dressed, or in garments that haven't been washed in days or weeks. It means the basic parental responsibility of ensuring children are properly clothed is not being met. But the clothing was just the beginning. Child Protective Services, CPS, had been involved with this family. There were reports of bruising on the children, physical marks that concerned enough people to trigger official intervention. Yet somehow Jack and Lilly remained in this dangerous environment. Daniel Martel, the stepfather who claimed to love these children, had admitted to using physical punishment when disciplining them. Despite official statements claiming there was never any physical discipline, Daniel's own words contradict this sanitized version of events. Even Janie Mackenzie, Daniel's mother, had made statements suggesting physical discipline was used in the household. The picture emerging is of children living in fear, walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next punishment might come. And then there were the drugs. The transcript references Daniel as a crackhead multiple times. Whether that's accurate or not, it points to substance abuse issues in a home where young children were trying to survive. Drug use creates unpredictable behavior, financial strain, and environments where children's safety becomes secondary to addiction needs. The financial desperation was crushing this family. They owed money everywhere. Daniel's minimal income from 1 day a week at the sawmill couldn't support 6 people. They had robbed Grandma. According to Daniel's own admissions, bank accounts were empty because any money deposited would be immediately garnished by creditors. Picture the stress in that household. Adults with substance issues, desperate for money, dealing with relationship conflicts, trying to manage 3 children while barely able to care for themselves. In that environment, children aren't blessings, they're expenses. They're mouths to feed, bodies to clothe, problems to manage. And the relationship between Daniel and Malaya was toxic and deteriorating. They were on the verge of collapse. On the very day the children disappeared, Malaya took baby Meadow and left to stay with her mother. She blocked Daniel on messaging apps. The family unit was disintegrating in real time. But here's what makes this situation truly horrifying. In that environment of neglect, substance use, and financial desperation, 2 innocent children were trying to survive. Jack and Lilly didn't choose this life. They didn't ask to be born into dysfunction. They were just babies trying to navigate a world where the adults who were supposed to protect them were failing them in every possible way. The bruising, the inappropriate clothing, the teacher interventions, the CPS involvement, these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern of systematic neglect that had been building for months or years. And when you combine that pattern with financial desperation, with relationship breakdown, with substance abuse issues, with the stress of managing multiple children on no income, you create the perfect conditions for the unthinkable to happen. Children become problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. In households like this, when pressure builds to unbearable levels, when adults are making desperate decisions to survive, children often pay the ultimate price. Not because they're deliberately targeted, but because they become inconvenient obstacles to whatever solution the adults have convinced themselves they need. The evidence suggests that's exactly what happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan. They weren't harmed in a moment of rage. They weren't victims of a random crime. They became casualties of a calculated decision made by people who saw them as financial and emotional burdens that needed to be eliminated. Do you believe that children can simply disappear this completely without help? Because what I'm about to reveal will prove they can't. The warrant documents reveal something that most people following this case have completely missed, something that exposes the level of planning and premeditation behind Jack and Lily's disappearance. RCMP sought records for text plus messages from May 1st and May 2nd from 3 redacted phone numbers. Text Plus is a VoIP service, a way to make calls and send messages using internet data rather than traditional phone service. It's popular with people who want to communicate without creating records on their primary devices. Why would a family with no money living in an area with poor cell service be using multiple VoIP lines? Why would they need alternative communication methods that don't show up on regular phone bills? The answer is simple. Because they were planning something they didn't want traced back to them. VoIP services create communication channels that are harder for investigators to track. They don't appear on standard phone records. They don't follow traditional billing patterns. They're perfect for people who need to coordinate activities without leaving obvious digital footprints, and the timing is crucial. May 1st and May 2nd, the day before and the day of the children's disappearance. What were Daniel, Malaya, and possibly Janie discussing on these alternative communication lines? What conversations were they having that couldn't go through their regular phones? What plans were they making that required this level of digital secrecy? The warrant documents don't reveal the content of these messages. They're redacted. But the very fact that investigators sought these records suggests they contained information relevant to the children's disappearance. Meanwhile, Daniel and Malaya were maintaining their public story about keeping location tracking enabled on their phones at all times. They painted themselves as transparent, cooperative parents with nothing to hide. They voluntarily provided their devices to investigators. But transparency is easy when you're using alternative communication methods for anything incriminating. You can hand over your primary phone with complete confidence if all the real planning happened on untraceable VoIP lines. The banking records tell another part of this digital deception story. RCMP analyzed their financial transactions, looking for any unusual activity around the time of the disappearance. What they found was a family in complete financial collapse. No money coming in except for Daniel's minimal sawmill wages, debts everywhere, creditors circling, and the stress of supporting not just themselves, but 3 children on essentially no income. In that environment, children represent a massive financial burden. Food, clothing, medical care, school supplies, all expenses this family couldn't afford. Jack and Lilly weren't just children to be loved and protected. They were economic liabilities in a household already drowning in debt. And then there's the location data analysis. Daniel and Malaya claimed they could track each other's movements through their phones. But conveniently, during the crucial hours when the children disappeared, there are gaps in their digital footprints. Gaps that suggest deliberate phone shutdowns. Gaps that indicate someone didn't want their movements recorded during specific time periods. Gaps that align perfectly with when 2 children needed to be transported away from their home without creating any digital evidence. The electronic investigation extended far beyond local records. RCMP sought information from companies in Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax, major Canadian cities. What kind of digital trail were they following? What connections did this case have to locations hundreds of miles away? The redacted company names and purposes hide crucial information, but the geographic scope suggests this investigation uncovered evidence of coordination with outside parties. Evidence that Jack and Lily's disappearance involved more than just the immediate family. Evidence that this wasn't a spontaneous tragedy, but a planned operation with digital fingerprints spanning multiple provinces. But perhaps most revealing of all is what happened to the family's communication patterns after the children disappeared. Malaya immediately blocked Daniel on messaging apps. Not after days of grief and blame. Not after the stress of investigation became overwhelming. Immediately. Why cut off communication with the person who supposedly shared your trauma? Why block the other adult who was present when your children vanished? Unless you're trying to prevent investigators from seeing your real-time digital communications, unless you're making sure there's no electronic record of what you were really saying to each other. The digital evidence reveals a family that was using technology not to find their missing children, but to hide their involvement in making those children disappear. And when you combine that digital deception with the physical evidence manipulation, you get a picture of a crime so carefully planned and executed that it almost worked. Almost. Because there was one piece of evidence they couldn't manipulate. One aspect of this case that would expose their guilt no matter how carefully they had planned. The timeline. The impossible, contradictory, ever-changing timeline that would ultimately reveal the truth about what really happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan. Let's break down the morning Jack and Lilly Sullivan vanished forever. When you analyze the timeline provided by Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks, their story seems impossible. Let's walk through their version of events step by step because the contradictions are so glaring, it's stunning that investigators didn't immediately take action. According to Daniel and Malaya, they were in bed with baby Meadow when they heard Jack and Lilly playing in the kitchen. Lilly allegedly came into the bedroom multiple times or poked her head in multiple times, depending on which version of their story you believe. But here's the first major problem. They never specify how long this went on. How long were they lying in bed while the children were unsupervised? 30 minutes? An hour? 2 hours? The vagueness isn't accidental, it's calculated. If they admitted to a specific time frame, investigators could have checked that against other evidence. They could verify whether the children's behavior that morning was consistent with their usual routines. They could determine whether the timeline made logical sense. Instead, Daniel and Malaya provided a deliberately vague window that could be adjusted to fit whatever narrative worked best. The next part of their timeline is even more revealing. They claimed that after a while, again, no specific time frame, they stopped hearing the children. The house became quiet, and instead of immediately checking on two young children who had gone silent, they continued lying in bed. What parent hears their children go quiet and doesn't immediately investigate? What responsible adult allows prolonged silence from a 4-year-old and 6-year-old without ensuring they're safe? But it gets worse. When Daniel finally got up to check on the children, he found them gone. Boots were missing, Lily's backpack was gone, and the wrench was still wedged in the front door, meaning they could only have left through the back sliding door. And then comes the most compelling part of their timeline. Daniel's response to discovering the missing children. Did he immediately wake Malaya? Did he call 911? Did he alert Janie in the backyard camper? Did he contact neighbors for help? No. He took the family car and went searching on his own. Think about that. Your stepchildren are missing, potentially in danger from the same black bear that required door barricades the night before, and your first instinct is to conduct a solo search rather than alerting authorities. Daniel claims he searched woods and culverts. He contacted friends to join the search. All of this happened before police were notified. Hours of search activity, multiple people involved, a comprehensive effort to find the children, all before anyone thought to call 911. Malaya finally called 911 at 10:00 a.m., not at 7:00 a.m. when Daniel first discovered them missing, not at 8:00 a.m. after his initial search turned up nothing, and not at 9:00 a.m. when panic should have been setting in. A 10:00 a.m. call came hours after the children had allegedly vanished. That delay isn't grief or shock. That delay is time spent coordinating stories, placing evidence, and ensuring that when authorities arrived, everything would support the narrative of children wandering off on their own. But the timeline manipulation doesn't end there. It extends to every piece of physical evidence in this case. The pink blanket that was in the children's bedroom on Friday morning was found torn in the woods Friday evening. That requires someone to have taken it from the house, torn it up, and placed it in the brush, all while maintaining the story that they were searching frantically for the missing children. The boot prints that appeared overnight between Friday and Saturday require someone to have access to Lily's boots and intimate knowledge of search patterns to know exactly where to place evidence for maximum discovery impact. The garbage bag with additional blanket pieces found at the end of their driveway on Saturday requires someone with access to the property to plant evidence in their own trash, knowing it would eventually be found and analyzed. Every piece of physical evidence in this case requires inside knowledge, property access, and careful timing. None of it could have been created by children wandering off on their own. But there's one timeline element that exposes this entire deception more clearly than anything else. Daniel's behavior during the polygraph scheduling process. When asked when he took his lie detector test, his response was, I don't really know the date. It was a couple weeks ago, I want to say. You don't remember the date of the most important test of your life? You don't recall the appointment that would either clear your name or make you a prime suspect in your stepchildren's disappearance? That's not forgetfulness, that's deliberate delay. That's buying time to prepare, to practice, to get your physiological responses under control. The timeline reveals something investigators seem to have missed. This wasn't a spontaneous tragedy. This was a calculated event with evidence placement, story coordination, and digital manipulation designed to create the perfect cover-up. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated how closely people would examine their story. They didn't account for the fact that in the digital age everything leaves a trace. And those traces are about to reveal the most disturbing truth of all. What really happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan, and why the people responsible are still living freely. Authorities don't want you to focus on the Sullivan family's financial situation, but it wasn't just difficult, it was catastrophic. And in households where money becomes more important than lives, where adults prioritize their survival over children's safety, the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Daniel Martell worked 1 day per week at a sawmill in Westville. 1 day, even at decent wages, that's maybe $150 to $200 per week. Try supporting 6 people, 2 adults, 3 children, and an infant, on $800 per month. It's impossible. They owed money everywhere. Credit cards, loans, utilities, rent. Debts were crushing this household from every direction. And when you're that financially desperate, when creditors are calling and utilities are being shut off, every expense becomes a crisis. Children are expensive. Food, clothing, medical care, school supplies, transportation, the costs add up quickly. For a family already drowning in debt, children can start to feel like financial anchors dragging them deeper into poverty. But here's what makes this financial desperation truly sinister. Jack and Lilly weren't Daniel's biological children. They were Malaya's kids from her previous relationship with Cody Sullivan. To Daniel, these weren't his children to love and protect. They were additional expenses he couldn't afford. The warrant documents reveal that Daniel had been with Malaya for 3 years as of May 2024. 3 years of financial strain, 3 years of trying to support children who weren't his responsibility. 3 years of watching his already limited resources stretch even thinner. And then there's the baby. Meadow was Daniel's biological child with Malaya, his blood, his responsibility, his future. In a household with limited resources, where difficult decisions about survival had to be made, which children would take priority? The math is cruel but simple. Eliminate the children who aren't yours. Keep the one who is, and suddenly your financial situation becomes manageable. Reduce your household from 6 people to 3, and that weekly SAW income starts to make sense. But financial motive is only part of the equation. The warrant documents reveal something even more disturbing about the family dynamics in the days leading up to the disappearance. Daniel and Malaya's relationship was disintegrating. The financial pressure, the stress of managing multiple children, the drug use, the constant conflict, it was all building toward a breaking point. And when relationships collapse in households with children, those children often become pawns in the emotional warfare. Malaya's decision to leave with baby Meadow on the day the children disappeared wasn't spontaneous grief, it was a planned exit strategy. She knew what was coming. She knew she needed to be somewhere else when investigators started asking questions about Jack and Lilly. The blocking of Daniel on messaging apps wasn't an emotional reaction, it was damage control. She was making sure there would be no digital record of their real communications, no evidence of their coordination, no trail leading back to their shared involvement. And here's the detail that reveals the true nature of their relationship with these children. Within days of Jack and Lily's disappearance, they were already moving on with their lives, planning for the future, and making arrangements that assumed the children were never coming back. This is not the behavior of grieving parents desperately hoping for their children's return. This is the behavior of people who knew exactly what had happened because they had made it happen. The financial investigation revealed more than just debt and desperation. It revealed a family that saw harm as a solution to their money problems, a family that calculated the cost of raising children against the benefit of their absence, and they almost got away with it. Because while investigators were analyzing bank records and tracking spending patterns, while they were following the money trail that led to motive, the real evidence was being systematically destroyed. A crime scene was cleaned so thoroughly that even professional investigators found nothing definitive, but they couldn't erase everything. They couldn't eliminate every trace of their involvement, and what they left behind would eventually expose the truth about what really happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan. The truth about how financial desperation and family dysfunction can turn innocent children into victims of the people who were supposed to love them most. Despite conducting one of the most extensive missing children investigations in maritime history, despite analyzing over 5,000 pieces of evidence, despite following 670 tips and interviewing hundreds of witnesses, the RCMP reached a conclusion that defies logic, contradicts evidence, and insults public intelligence. Jack and Lily's disappearance is not believed to be criminal in nature. Not criminal. 2 children vanish without a trace from a household with documented neglect, financial desperation, and substance abuse issues. And somehow investigators can't find reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense occurred. Let me walk you through what RCMP actually discovered during their investigation. Because when you see the evidence they collected, their conclusion becomes not just wrong, but willfully ignorant. They pumped septic systems looking for human remains. They searched forests, lakes, and every body of water in the area. They collected video footage from an 8-kilometer radius around the family home. They analyzed electronic communications, banking records, and digital footprints. They conducted polygraph examinations on multiple family members. They tracked down every tip, no matter how far-fetched. They deployed helicopters, ground teams, and professional search dogs. They left no stone unturned in their quest to find these children, and they found nothing, absolutely nothing to suggest Jack and Lilly Sullivan were alive anywhere in the wilderness areas surrounding their home. But they did find evidence of deception. They found planted physical evidence. They found contradictory timelines. They found financial motive. They found a pattern of neglect and mistreatment. They found digital manipulation and communication secrecy. They found everything except the children. So, how do you conduct the most thorough investigation possible, uncover overwhelming evidence of deception and motive, find no trace of children surviving in the wilderness, and still conclude that no crime occurred? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about how these cases are handled when the suspects are the parents themselves. There's an institutional reluctance to pursue parents for the disappearance of their children without a body. Law enforcement agencies don't want to risk their conviction rates on cases that rely entirely on circumstantial evidence. Police departments don't want to admit they can't solve cases against the most vulnerable victims. So they create alternative narratives. They focus on possibilities rather than probabilities. They emphasize the lack of direct evidence while ignoring the mountain of circumstantial evidence that points to involvement. In the Sullivan case, that alternative narrative became, children wandered off and perished in the wilderness, but their bodies haven't been found yet. It's neat, it's tidy, it absolves everyone of responsibility while avoiding the uncomfortable truth that sometimes parents harm their children and get away with it. But this narrative requires you to believe impossible things. That 2 small children decided to venture into a dangerous wilderness without adult supervision. That they traveled far enough from home to avoid detection by professional search teams. That they perished in a location so remote that their bodies can't be found despite extensive searching. That all the planted evidence was just coincidental. It requires you to ignore the financial motive, the patterns of neglect, the timeline contradictions, and the digital manipulation. It requires you to believe that sometimes children just vanish into thin air. The RCMP investigation was thorough in collecting evidence, but completely inadequate in analyzing what that evidence revealed. They had all the pieces of the puzzle, but refused to put them together because the completed picture was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. 2 children were victims of their caregivers, and the investigation was designed to avoid that conclusion rather than pursue it. But the evidence speaks for itself. The warrant documents, even heavily redacted, reveal a family with motive, opportunity, and a pattern of deception that extends from the moment the children disappeared to the present day. Jack and Lilly Sullivan didn't wander into the woods. They didn't perish in some tragic accident. They were harmed by people who saw them as problems to be solved rather than children to be protected. And the system that was supposed to seek justice for them, instead, chose to look the other way. Here's something that will make you question everything about how justice works in Canada. The map showing Pictou County's jurisdiction also reveals that the same person serves as both Minister of Justice and Attorney General for this region. One person oversees both the investigation and the prosecution decisions, controlling both the search for evidence and the determination of whether that evidence constitutes criminal activity. Does that sound like a system designed to find truth or a system designed to control outcomes? When the same authority that guides police investigations also decides whether charges will be filed, you create the perfect environment for cover-ups. You eliminate the checks and balances that are supposed to ensure accountability. And in the Sullivan case, that consolidated power structure has produced exactly what you'd expect: an investigation that collected compelling evidence but refused to acknowledge what that evidence revealed. Think about the impossibility of their official conclusion. After the most extensive search in regional history, after analyzing thousands of pieces of evidence, after uncovering clear patterns of deception and motive, authorities concluded that no crime occurred, but their own evidence contradicts that conclusion at every turn. They found planted physical evidence. They documented timeline contradictions. They revealed financial desperation. They uncovered digital manipulation. They discovered patterns of neglect and CPS involvement. They found everything you'd expect to find in a case involving harm to a child, except official acknowledgement that such an event had occurred. And here's what makes this situation even more insidious. While authorities were refusing to pursue criminal charges, the family was already moving forward with their lives as if Jack and Lilly had never existed. Daniel and Malaya were buying tickets to local events. They were making plans that assumed the children were never coming back. They were behaving like people who knew exactly what had happened because they had made it happen. No parent of genuinely missing children behaves this way. No mother whose babies might still be alive somewhere, cold and scared and calling for help, starts planning entertainment activities days after their disappearance. But if you know your children are gone because of your actions, then moving on with your life makes perfect sense. The cover-up extends beyond just avoiding criminal charges. It includes the selective release of information, the heavy redaction of crucial evidence, and the promotion of impossible theories that deflect attention from obvious suspects. International attention on this case has been dismissed as online obsession by people spreading theories and misinformation. But that international attention exists because people around the world can see what Canadian authorities refuse to acknowledge: that this is clearly a case of family tragedy being disguised as accidental disappearance. Thousands of people across multiple countries are demanding answers that Canadian law enforcement refuses to provide. Not because they're conspiracy theorists or armchair detectives, but because the evidence is so obvious that it's painful to watch authorities ignore it. The cover-up includes character assassination of anyone asking difficult questions. It includes dismissing legitimate concerns as misinformation. It includes using official authority to silence dissent rather than address evidence. But perhaps most disgusting of all, it includes allowing baby Meadow to remain in the custody of people who very likely caused harm to her half-siblings. That innocent child is living with potential wrongdoers because admitting the truth about Jack and Lilly would require authorities to acknowledge their complete failure to protect children who desperately needed protection. The system failed Jack and Lilly when they were alive, allowing them to remain in a household with documented issues despite clear warning signs. And now that same system is failing them in their absence by refusing to pursue justice for them. This isn't just a missing children case that went unsolved. This is institutional complicity. This is what happens when protecting official reputations becomes more important than protecting innocent lives. And it's still happening right now. As you watch this, Meadow Sullivan is still in a potentially unsafe situation. The people responsible for Jack and Lily's disappearance are still free. The system is still prioritizing political convenience over child safety. After everything we've examined, the impossible timeline, the planted evidence, the financial motive, the digital manipulation, the patterns of neglect, and the institutional cover-up, one truth emerges that authorities desperately want to keep hidden. Jack and Lilly Sullivan were victims of their caregivers. And the system designed to protect children chose to look the other way rather than pursue difficult truths. This case represents something far more terrifying than 2 children disappearing. It represents the complete failure of every institution that was supposed to keep them safe. Child Protective Services knew about the situation but left them in the home. Teachers knew about the neglect but couldn't intervene effectively. Police investigators found overwhelming evidence but refused to pursue a path toward justice. The justice system had every tool necessary to seek accountability but chose political convenience instead. Jack and Lilly Sullivan fell through every safety net our society claims to provide for vulnerable children, and their deaths were then concealed by the same institutions that failed to protect their lives. But their story doesn't end with failure. It continues with the thousands of people around the world who refuse to let their deaths be forgotten. People who see through the official narratives and demand real answers. People who understand that when we fail to protect children, we fail as a civilization. Every person watching this video, every person sharing Jack and Lilly's story, every person demanding accountability, you're all part of ensuring their legacy isn't just tragedy, but change. Because cases like this happen when we allow systems to protect themselves rather than the children they serve. They happen when we accept convenient explanations rather than demanding difficult truths. They happen when we let politics override justice. The Sullivan case should be studied in law schools as an example of investigative failure. It should be referenced in social work training as a case study in system breakdown. It should be mandatory viewing for anyone working in child protection. But most importantly, it should be remembered as proof that children's lives matter more than adult comfort, that seeking justice for innocent children is more important than protecting institutional reputations. Jack and Lilly Sullivan deserved better. They deserved to grow up safe, loved, and protected. They deserved adults who saw them as precious gifts rather than financial burdens. They deserved a system that would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. They didn't get any of that. But their story can still matter. Their deaths can still mean something. Their memory can still drive change. After learning all of this and seeing how the system has handled this case, how do you feel about the state of child protection in our society? What action do you think is needed, and what will you do to help prevent similar tragedies?